The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal, laced with the faint tang of ozone from the electric storms raging outside the fortress walls. The grand citadel of Gethran stood like an iron monolith against the storm-reddened sky, its obsidian spires reaching up like the claws of some ancient beast. Inside its vaulted halls, under the glow of bioluminescent torches, the rulers of war-gutted empires had gathered. Tonight, the Gethran Dominion would once again remind the galaxy who ruled. Commander Elias, a towering reptilian with jagged black scales, head of the chamber. His heavy battle cloak, stitched together from the hides of conquered species, dragged behind him as he observed the assembled diplomats and warriors. His golden eyes flickered with contempt when they landed on the latest guests of the humans. They sat at the far end of the long, steel banquet table, separated from the more worthy species at least. That's how the Gethrans saw it. Captain Elias Ward, the human envoy, lounged with practiced ease, his fingers drumming idly against the table's cold surface. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable, but the ghost of a smirk. He knew exactly what this was, a spectacle. The Gethrans had spent centuries carving out their supremacy with blood, fire, and the most feared weapon in the galaxy, Othcornine, a neurotoxin so potent that even the scent of it could liquefy the lungs of weaker species. It was their ultimate tool of dominance, a single sip enough to kill kings, emperors, and warlords. And tonight, they would use it to put humanity in its place. A gong sounded, deep and reverberating, silencing the murmurs of the gathered. Elias raised his clawed hand, and servants clad in silver armor approached, carrying a goblet of black glass, its surface shimmering with an eerie, venomous. The room fell into dead silence. Elias's voice was like stone grinding against steel as he spoke. For centuries, we Gethrans have tested the worth of those who claim power. He gestured toward the goblet. Our poison Othcornine is the lifeblood of our dominion. No species has ever withstood it. No species ever will. His gaze locked onto Elias. Drink. If you survive, perhaps your kind is worth something after all. Murmurs rippled through the room. Several diplomats from other species shook their heads in disbelief. The humans had been foolish to accept this invitation. Elias didn't move at first. He merely stared at the goblet as if it were nothing more than a glass of cheap. Elias leaned forward, his golden eyes hungry for weakness. He had seen creatures beg, grovel, and sob at this moment. But Elias just chuckled. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the nervous laughter of a man cornered. It wasn't bravado masking fear. It was amusement. Slowly, deliberately, Elias reached for the goblet. The moment his fingers brushed against it, several of the onlookers flinched as if the very act of touching it was enough to sign his death warrant. Elias lifted the goblet to eye level, swirling the dark liquid inside. It was thicker than oil, almost alive in the way it clung to the glass. He took a whiff. A Gethran warrior let out a low, guttural growl. Another alien diplomat covered their mouth in horror. Elias grinned, and then, in full view of the entire hall, he tilted his head back and took a. The effect should have been instantaneous. Veins should have blackened. Muscles should have locked up in agonized spasms. His nervous system should have melted down as his brain shut off like a. Instead, Elias lowered the goblet with a contemplative hum. He smacked his lips, rolling the flavor over his tongue like a connoisseur at a. He took another sip. Tastes kinda like cheap tequila. The entire room froze. Elias's nostrils flared. His golden eyes narrowed to slits, confusion flickering beneath his fury. Impossible. The scientists in the crowd began whispering frantically, exchanging panicked. The poison was pure, untouched. There was no trickery here, no sleight of hand, no antidote. And yet, the human still breathed. Elias, completely at ease, set the goblet down, sliding it back across the. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and exhaled, as if mildly. That's it, he mused, shaking his head. I was expecting more of a kick. The silence was deafening. One of the Gethran guards instinctively reached for his weapon, but Irakvos snapped his hand up, stopping him cold. No, this was something else. This was worse than treachery. This was fear. For the first time in Gethran history, their ultimate weapon had failed. Elias knew it too. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, and fixed Irakvos with a lazy, lopsided grin. So he drawled, voice dripping with amusement. "What's next?" The chamber was so silent, it felt like the air itself had turned to stone. No one moved. No one breathed. The universe had stopped spinning for just a fraction of a second, trying to recalculate reality. Irakvos was staring at Elias as if the human had just grown a second head. His massive claws tensed against the table's edge, the steel groaning under the... This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The poison should have left Elias writhing, eyes boiling in their sockets. The sight of human frailty should have filled the room with a smug certainty that the Gethran Dominion was untouchable. Instead, Elias just sat there, drumming his fingers against the tabletop like he... Damn. Elias exhaled, looking at the goblet again. I was expecting something exotic, but this is just... Wait. The room reacted instantly. A diplomat from the Vesca system, an amphibian-like species known for their chemical mastery, reeled back in horror, their gills flaring wildly. One of the insectoid Pithak chattered something to its companion, its mandibles clicking in what could only be disbelief. And then the murmurs began. No, this wasn't possible. The Gethrans had tested Othcor-9 on over 300 species, from the warlike Tarati to the bioengineered Tly. All of them had perished within moments of exposure. Even the most toxin-resistant species in the known galaxy, the Grell, had fallen. And yet, this human, the soft-skinned, primitive, oxygen-breathing mammal was still sitting there, completely unharmed. Elias smiled, lacing his fingers together as he met Irakvos' stunned gaze. "Something wrong, Commander?" Irakvos' eyes narrowed to slits. For the first time in decades, something very close to fear crept into his. He turned sharply toward one of the Gethran scientists, who stood frozen at the edge of the chamber. "Test it." The scientist hesitated. "But, test it." Irakvos' voice was a blade against the air. The scientist rushed forward, taking the goblet with trembling claws. He pulled a sleek, glass-dipped instrument from his belt and dipped it into the... The device beeped twice before a holographic analysis projected into the air. Othcor-9. Untouched. Unaltered. The poison was pure. Irakvos' stomach twisted. The whispers around the room escalated into frantic murmurs. If the poison was pure, that meant one thing. Humans were immune. Irakvos' claws slammed against the table. The entire chamber jumped as the metal dented under his force. "Lies." His voice was a guttural snarl. "You tampered with it. You humans brought some trick, some foul deception." Elias shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "Feel free to check me for antidotes." Irakvos snapped his fingers. The Gethran guards immediately rushed forward, weapons drawn. One clamped a bioscanner against Elias' neck, while the other dragged the claw down the seam of his uniform, searching for hidden tech or injectors. The scanner flashed green. No foreign substances detected. No tricks. No antidotes. No deception. The reality of the situation settled over the room like a dark cloud. Elias Ward had just survived the deadliest poison in the galaxy. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was fear. The Vescan diplomat edged back toward the exit, whispering frantically to his. The insectoid Pithak shrank into their carapaces, looking between each other in silent conversation. This wasn't just an embarrassing failure for the Gethrans. This was a catastrophic loss of power. For centuries, the fear of Othcor-9 had kept planets in check. It was more than a poison, it was a symbol of Gethran supremacy. If a single sip could bring warlords and conquerors to their knees, what hope did the weaker species have? But now, Now there was something worse than the poison. Humans. The realization settled into the bones of every ruler in that room. If humans could shrug off Gethran, what else could they survive? Elias watched them panic, saw the way the diplomats leaned away from the Gethran. Leaders, suddenly uncertain if they'd been backing the right side. Then he made it worse. He took another sip and grinned. Really? You guys should market this. It'd sell great as a novelty liquor back home. It was the last straw. Elias roared, flipping the table in a burst of rage. The goblet went flying, shattering against the marble floor. Guards rushed forward, their weapons raised. Elias didn't even blink. He stood slowly, dusting off his uniform. He turned toward his second-in-command, a human woman with steel-gray eyes, standing near the chamber's edge. Without a word, he gave her a single, subtle nod. She reached into her sleeve and pressed a concealed button on her wristband. Somewhere, high above the planet, an encrypted signal pulsed through the void. The human fleet was coming. Elias was seething, his golden eyes ablaze with barely restrained fury. He wanted violence. He wanted Elias dead, right here, right now. But something held him back. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he could win. Elias stretched his arms, cracking his neck with a satisfied sigh. He met Elias's glare with a smirk that was all teeth. So, he gestured around the room. What's next, Commander? Are you going to kill me? Or are you finally realizing that you picked the wrong fight? A muscle twitched in Elias's jaw. His claws curled into fists. For the first time in Gethran history, he had no answer. Elias stood motionless, his golden reptilian eyes locked onto Elias Ward. The chamber was eerily silent, the only sounds the distant rumbles of Gethran's toxic storms outside and the quiet, almost imperceptible breaths of every diplomat and warlord in the room. They were watching him, waiting. For centuries, his species had wielded fear like a blade. The mere mention of Gethran had been enough to keep entire civilizations in. It was their unbreakable weapon, their absolute leverage in the delicate balance. And this human had just casually destroyed it in front of everyone. Elias still stood there, relaxed, unbothered, his uniform dusted off from the... His smirk was still there, but now there was something else behind it, not just amusement, but certainty. He knew exactly what he had done. He had shattered the myth of Gethran invincibility. Elias clenched his claws into fists. If he had acted immediately, cut the human down right here, perhaps the other would have forgotten this moment. But hesitation was a disease. It spread, eating through control like rust through iron. The murmurs in the chamber were already growing. And worse, the fear was not in the humans. It was in the Gethrans. In the lower depths of the Citadel, a group of Gethran scientists worked feverishly in a high-security laboratory. 3 geneticists, 2 biochemists, and a cybernetic analyst, some of the brightest minds in the Empire, all hunched over a reinforced stasis chamber, filled with the remnants of the poison. They had scanned it 3 times. The results were the same. Untouched, pure. Dr. Castor, the senior biochemist, hissed under his breath as he rejected the... This cannot be possible. His assistant, a younger Gethran with nervous eyes, whispered, Sir, if the toxin is working as intended, then... Castor snapped his gaze toward him, his throat clicking in agitation. Say it. The younger scientist swallowed hard. Then it means humans are naturally resistant. The words felt like a funeral bell. The entire lab went silent. Gethran's superiority was built on Gethran. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a belief system. It was proof that they were stronger, more evolved, than no species could ever. And yet, a single human had laughed in its face. Castor stepped back from the console, hands trembling slightly. He had been a scientist for over 40 years. He had studied every species the Gethrans had conquered, every biological anomaly, every evolutionary advantage. But never, not once, had he encountered something like this. The assistant hesitated before whispering the question they were all too afraid. If they can survive Othkar 9, what else can they survive? Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to know. The panic in the Grand Chamber was growing. Several diplomats were already backing away from the Gethran delegation, whispering frantically to their advisors. Allies who had once feared them were now reconsidering their loyalties. Urak felt the shift in the air. He knew what was coming. The first cracks of doubt had already splintered across the Empire's foundation. If he let this moment continue, he would lose everything. Seize him. The order was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. The Gethran elite guards surged forward, their energy weapons humming as they activated their restraints. Elias didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just sighed. You sure about that? Urak bared his teeth. You think your human tricks will save you? You think we fear you? Elias exhaled slowly, looking over his shoulder at his second in command, Lieutenant Avery Holt, standing near the exit. She didn't even blink. Instead, she lifted her wrist, tapping her holo communicator once. A small blue light flashed. A heartbeat later, every console in the chamber flickered with a sudden, violent. Then, a cold, mechanical voice boomed through the Citadel's speakers. This is the UES. Dauntless. Gethran's system is locked. Stand down or face consequences. The fear turned to terror. Outside the Citadel, the sky split open. The Dauntless, a human battle cruiser, had just exited FTL above the planet hand. 4 destroyers, 6 corvettes, a dozen fighter squadrons. Every ship was fully armed, weapons primed and locked onto key Gethran military. They had arrived completely undetected, bypassing the Gethran early warning systems as if they had never existed at all. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a message. Humans had come to watch, to study, to understand how their enemies fought. And now they were ready to win. Urak froze, his mind scrambling for options. His empire was powerful. His fleet stretched across dozens of systems. But the human fleet had appeared in their capital system undetected. They had just proven that they were immune to the Empire's deadliest weapon. And now, they were staring down at Gethra itself. You brought war to us, he snarled. Elias laughed, shaking his head. Oh no, you did that yourself. Urak knew he was out of time. The other diplomats were already moving away, some activating private communications with their homeworlds. The Empire was cracking before his eyes, because now, nobody feared the Gethrans. They feared the humans. Desperation twisted in Urak gut. His claws tightened around his weapon. He could kill Elias here, right now. It wouldn't change the fact that his empire was burning, but at least he would have that. His finger twitched over the trigger, and then Elias grinned. Go ahead, he said, voice deadly soft. Give me an excuse. The Dauntless loomed over the planet, its cannons primed. Urak saw it then. The end. The Gethran Empire had ruled for centuries through poison and fear. But when their weapon failed, when their terror shattered, they had nothing left. Elias turned toward Avery, giving her a casual nod. Tell the fleet to stand by. We'll be leaving soon. He glanced back at Urak, his smirk widening. Thanks for the drink, by the way. Then he walked away, and the Empire crumbled behind him. Urak stood frozen in the center of the Grand Chamber, his golden eyes wide, but unfocused, staring past Elias Ward as if seeing something no one else could. The moment had passed. The moment where he could have acted, where he could have seized the human end. Ripped his throat out in front of the entire galactic delegation, reasserting. But he hadn't moved. And now, it was too late. The Empire, he had spent his life defending the Empire his ancestors had forged. And war and conquest was cracking apart right in front of him. The human was walking away, untouched, unafraid, unstoppable. And above them, in the swirling void of space, a fleet of human warships loomed. casting long shadows over Gethra's once proud citadel. Iraq-Voss had lost. The alien delegates moved first, one by one, diplomats, warlords, and emissaries from every corner of the galaxy stepped back from the Gethran leaders as if they had suddenly become. A Vescan diplomat, his pale amphibian skin glistening under the torchlight, activated his holo-link with trembling fingers. Within seconds, the image of his homeworld's chancellor flickered to life. Several trade agreements with the Gethrans. Effective immediately, the command sent shockwaves through the room. More followed. The insectoid Pithak emissary let out a clicking sigh before muttering in his native tongue, "We must realign with stronger allies." The metal-skinned Tarati, who had once considered the Gethrans their closest military partners, silently turned and left the chamber, making it clear that their alliance was over. Within minutes, centuries of carefully cultivated relationships, diplomatic agreements, and military coalitions were collapsing. And the humans hadn't fired a single shot. Deep in the lower levels of the Citadel, Dr. Castor was still staring at his scanner in stunned silence. Off-Core 9 was perfectly pure, but the human had survived. That meant that every tactic the Gethrans had built their military doctrine upon. The scientist's claws trembled as he tapped at his console, trying to find anything that could make sense of this. He pulled up historical records on human biology, scouring every medical archive. The Empire had gathered on them. What he found made his blood run cold. Humans were not just resistant to toxins. They had evolved to withstand pain, adapt to poisons, and even grow stronger through repeated exposure to deadly substances. Capsaicin, a chemical that caused agony to most species. They ate it for fun. Radiation levels that would kill a Gethran in minutes. Some humans worked in it for decades. Even the most lethal venoms known to the galaxy. There were cases of humans developing immunity by deliberately injecting themselves with it over time. They didn't just survive. They adapted. They evolved. And now, they were here. Castor swallowed hard and sent an urgent message to Iraq-Voss. "Commander, the humans are not normal. They are not like us. They are something else." A long pause. Then, finally, Iraq-Voss responded, "I know." Elias Ward reached the Citadel's main entrance, his boots clicking against the polished black marble as his second-in-command, Lieutenant Avery Holt, matched. Her expression was calm, but he could see the amusement flickering behind her. "That went well," she smirked. Elias chuckled. "Yeah." Poor lizards didn't know what hit him. A deep, rumbling explosion suddenly shook the ground beneath them. They both stopped, turned, and watched as, behind them, the Gethran civilization began to tear itself. Riots, fires, entire power structures imploding. What centuries of war and conquest had built, one human had dismantled without lifting a weapon. Avery sighed, glancing up at the Dauntless, still waiting in orbit. "So, what now?" Elias exhaled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Now," he smirked, "we see who comes begging for an alliance." And with that, the humans left the Citadel, victorious. Behind them, the age of the Gethrans was over. Back in the Grand Chamber, Iraq-Voss sank into his throne, his massive frame sagging with the weight of inevitability. His people were fracturing. His rule was over. And the worst part, it hadn't even been a war. The humans had simply shown up hand in doing so. They had rewritten the balance. Iraq-Voss reached for the shattered remains of the goblet, his claws curling around the broken glass. Slowly, methodically, he lifted a remaining shard to his lips, letting the last few drops of Off-Core 9 touch his tongue. The poison burned, but he barely noticed. He needed to understand. Why them? Why now? And more importantly, what else were they capable of? He closed his eyes, tasting the bitterness. And for the first time in his long, war-hardened life, Iraq-Voss felt truly afraid. The sky above Gethra burned with the afterglow of the human fleet. The Dauntless and her escort ship still loomed high in orbit, their silhouettes impossibly vast against the pale green storm clouds that churned across them. No weapons had fired. No soldiers had invaded. Yet, the Gethran Dominion was finished. Across the planet's capital, rebellion had ignited. Citizens once bound by the iron grip of their warlords suddenly realized that their leaders weren't as strong as they had believed. Some fled, others fought, but none could deny the truth. The Gethrans had lost their greatest weapon, and humanity had just stepped onto the galactic stage as something far more terrifying than anyone had expected. Captain Elias Ward strode onto the Dauntless's bridge, his boots making a satisfying thud against the polished metal floor. The ship was alive with quiet efficiency officers monitoring tactical readouts, engineers scanning for potential hostiles, comms officers handling the flood of incoming diplomatic requests from alien governments. The galaxy had seen what happened on Gethra, and now, they wanted to talk. Lieutenant Avery Holt stood near the holographic display, arms crossed, eyes locked on the screen as data poured in. She glanced at Elias as he approached. "We're getting priority messages from over a dozen different factions. Half of them are former Gethran allies. The others, well, let's just say they're curious about us now." Elias smirked. "Curious? Avery nodded. "Very. Some want treaties. Others just want to know exactly how the hell we're immune to one of the deadliest poisons in the galaxy." Elias exhaled, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "And the Gethrans?" Avery snorted. "They're pretending this isn't happening." She tapped the display, showing intercepted transmissions from Gethran leaders. "Most of the high command is in hiding. There are rumors of infighting. Looks like their entire power structure is collapsing." Elias chuckled. "Well, that was fast." Avery smirked. "Turns out fear isn't the best foundation for an empire." Elias let that sit for a moment. The Gethrans had ruled through intimidation, poison, and control, but the second their weapon failed, their entire identity collapsed in on itself. And humanity? They had proven that fear wasn't enough to stop them. Far below, in the ruins of the Gethran citadel, Irak Voss sat alone in his. The vast chamber was in shambles. The long ceremonial table where countless war pacts had been signed and broken lay overturned. Holoscreens flickered between static and emergency transmissions, broadcasting news of planetary revolts, military defections, and the breakdown of their vast. He could hear it outside. The chaos, the screams of a dying empire. His claws tightened against the armrests of his throne, the cracked leather groaning under his grip. The poison had failed. The illusion of their supremacy had shattered. And worst of all, the humans hadn't even been trying to destroy them. Irak Voss slowly raised the shattered goblet of Othgranine, the last few drops of the legendary toxin clinging to the bottom. His golden eyes reflected back at him in the polished surface, but for the first time in his life, they looked uncertain. "They survived," he muttered. His voice, once a force that could command armies, sounded small now. He lifted the goblet to his lips and let the last of the poison flow down his. It burned, but he hardly noticed, because the real poison wasn't in the cup. It was in his mind, and it was the realization that everything he had ever believed was a lie. Back on the Dauntless, Elias stood at the observation deck, hands in his pockets, watching the planet slowly turning below. Avery joined him, handing him a datapad. "What's next?" Elias took a long breath, considering. "We let the galaxy talk." Avery raised an eyebrow. "Talk?" Elias grinned. "They're already doing it. They'll tell each other the stories. About the human who drank the unbeatable poison. About how our ships arrived in Gethran space undetected. About how we walked away without ever drawing a weapon." Avery's smirk widened as she caught on. "We don't need to force them to be afraid." Elias nodded. "They'll make us legends on their own." The two officers watched the planet below for a long moment. The Dauntless's comms officer called out, "Sir, incoming request from the Tarati delegation. They're requesting an immediate diplomatic audience." Avery smirked. That didn't take long. Elias turned, heading back toward the command bridge, a satisfied smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Humanity had arrived, and the galaxy would never see them the same way again. Months later, in the distant reaches of the galaxy, a meeting was taking place. Ambassadors from a dozen species sat at a long, crescent-shaped table, engaged in heated discussion. At the center of it all, a massive holoscreen displayed a single image. A still frame of Elias Ward lifting the goblet of Gethran to his lips, smirking as he took a sip. It was now legend. A Vescan delegate spoke first. If the humans can survive Gethran, what else are they capable of? No one answered, because no one knew. And that was the real terror. The deadliest thing in the galaxy isn't a poison. It's a human who knows he's stronger than you.